The dust was still settling over what had been her life when Clara Hale realized she was utterly, completely, and terrifyingly alone in the Wyoming Territory with a baby growing inside her and nowhere left to go. She stood at the edge of what remained of the Hale homestead, a scorched chimney stack, a crumbled foundation, 3 walls of a barn that the fire had decided were not worth finishing, and she pressed both hands against her abdomen. Not showing yet, barely 2 months along, but she knew. She had known for 3 weeks, ever since the morning sickness had started waking her before dawn, before the roosters, before even the magpies began their chatter in the pines. She had known, and she had told herself it would be fine because Thomas was there. Thomas would make it fine. Thomas always made things fine. Thomas Hale had been dead for 11 days. The fever had taken him fast. One morning he had come inside from checking on the horses and said he felt strange, a little warm. And by the following Thursday, he was in the ground beside the apple tree he had planted the spring they arrived. Clara had done everything right. She had sent for the doctor in Laramie, but the doctor was 2 days out and the fever was faster. She had pressed cool cloths to Thomas's forehead until her arms ached. She had prayed the way her mother had taught her, the old Scots Presbyterian prayers that had no mercy in them, but a great deal of endurance. None of it had mattered. Now it was the first week of October, 1878, and the wind coming down off the Medicine Bow Range already had teeth in it. The sky was the particular shade of iron gray that old-timers in the Wyoming Territory wore like a badge, that color that meant you had maybe 6 weeks before the real cold arrived, and then it would not leave until April. Clara had 6 weeks of supplies left if she was careful. She had a draft horse named Biscuit, who was gentle and slow and reliable. She had $43 hidden in a tobacco tin beneath the floorboard of the root cellar, the only structure still standing in a recognizable way. She had the clothes on her back and 2 changes of everything else inside a battered leather trunk. And she had a baby she had not asked for and could not imagine being without. She had 22 years behind her and no family within 1,000 miles. Thomas's brother lived in Ohio. He had not written in 2 years. She had a cousin in Colorado Territory, last she knew, but that was the last she knew, and last was a long time ago. The nearest town was Elkhorn Crossing, 14 miles east, and she had been there twice in the 8 months they had homesteaded here. Twice. Both times Thomas had driven the wagon, and she had sat beside him on the bench, watching the high country unfold around her like something she had never quite believed was real. She was going to have to walk to Elkhorn Crossing, or she was going to have to stay here and freeze. Clara picked up the leather trunk and decided she was not ready to freeze. She loaded what she could onto Biscuit's back, the trunk, the remaining flour and salt pork, a wool blanket, the tobacco tin, and she led him east along the track that cut through the sage flats. The morning was cold enough that her breath showed, and the mountains to the west were already draped in white from last week's early storm. She walked rather than rode because she did not yet trust herself on horseback alone, had never been particularly confident with horses in the way Thomas had been. She held the lead rope and walked, and the sage rattled dry in the wind, and the sky got no friendlier as the morning wore on. She had covered perhaps 4 miles when the nausea hit. It was not the gentle, manageable morning sickness she had been experiencing thus far. It came like a wave, sudden and absolute, and she had barely enough time to release Biscuit's rope before she was on her hands and knees in the sage, bringing up the coffee and the 2 hard biscuits she had eaten before leaving. When it passed, she sat back on her heels and pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth and tried to breathe through the aftermath. Biscuit watched her with the calm, uninvested patience of a horse that had seen stranger things. She stood. She took the rope. She kept walking. By noon, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and the clouds had thickened, and the track ahead of her had become considerably less clear, dissolving into a maze of game trails and cattle paths that all looked roughly equivalent to a woman who had covered this ground exactly twice and both times from a wagon seat. Clara stopped and turned in a slow circle, looking for landmarks. She could see the dark line of timber maybe 2 miles to the north, and she could see the ridge to the south, but the track had simply ceased to be a track in any useful sense, and Elkhorn Crossing was still, she estimated, somewhere between 8 and 10 miles away. She turned Biscuit north, toward the tree line, because trees meant shelter from the wind that had now picked up considerably, and she thought she could follow the timber east and eventually find the wagon road that led into town. It was sound reasoning for a woman who knew the country. For Clara, it was the beginning of getting genuinely lost. By 2 in the afternoon, she was in the pines, and the track she was following was definitely a game trail. And Biscuit had started to favor his left front leg in a way that made her chest tighten with fresh alarm. She stopped and crouched to look at the hoof, saw a stone lodge just inside the shoe, and spent 10 minutes working it free with the small knife she carried in her coat pocket. When she stood again, her fingers were numb, and the light had that flat, low quality that meant the afternoon was ending prematurely beneath the cloud cover. She tied Biscuit to a pine and sat down against the trunk with her blanket around her shoulders and tried to calculate what she should do. She could keep moving east through the timber and hope she hit the wagon road before dark. She could make camp here and try again in the morning. She could, and here she forced herself to acknowledge the reality of her situation with the same quiet stubbornness that had characterized every difficult thing in her 22 years. She could be in real trouble. The temperature at night in the Wyoming Territory in early October could drop below freezing. She had no shelter beyond trees. She had one blanket. She was 2 months pregnant and had been walking for 6 hours and had not kept food down since yesterday evening. Her hands were shaking, and not entirely from cold. She pulled her knees to her chest and rested her forehead against them and did not cry, because crying cost energy she did not have, but she let herself feel the weight of it for 1 long minute. The weight of Thomas being gone, the weight of the homestead in ashes, the weight of this baby, this impossible, unwanted, and yet absolutely wanted baby, and the absolute absence of anyone in the world who was expecting her anywhere. Then she lifted her head because that was what she did, and she heard hoofbeats. They were coming from the north, moving fast through the timber, and then they slowed, and through the pines she saw a horse that was nothing like Biscuit, a big, dark animal, all power and muscle, picking through the trees with the confidence of a horse that knew this country deeply. And on the horse was a man. He was large in the way that mountains are large, which is to say, his size was not immediately the most remarkable thing about him, but it became the most remarkable thing the longer you looked. He sat the dark horse the way men who have spent most of their lives in the saddle sight it, not elegantly, not with any kind of performance about it, just completely and naturally, as if the horse were an extension of his own body. He wore a heavy canvas coat and worn leather trousers and boots that had covered considerable miles, and his hair was dark and longer than a man in a city would have worn it, falling just past the collar of his coat. He had a rifle across his back and a look on his face that was not quite surprise but was not quite its absence either. He pulled up 20 feet from her and looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at Biscuit, then at the trunk strapped to Biscuit's back, then back at her. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said. His voice was low and even, not unfriendly, but not warm either. The voice of a man who chose his words carefully because he spent a great deal of time not using them at all. "I was going to Elkhorn Crossing," Clara said, and she was proud that her voice came out steadily. "I believe I may have made a wrong turn." "You made about 6 of them." He swung down from the horse in one motion, and when he stood on the ground, she revised her assessment of his size upward. He was well over 6 feet, and the canvas coat did nothing to disguise the breadth of his shoulders or the hard, physical substance of him. This was a man built by years of actual labor, not by any vanity. His hands, when he reached up to loosen his horse's girth, were enormous and scarred in the way that working hands get scarred, and the set of his jaw and the line of his neck suggested a strength that was simply the natural result of the life he lived. His face was weathered and angular, dark-eyed beneath heavy brows, with several days of beard that was more about not having shaved than any intentional cultivation of it. He looked at her with those dark eyes, and she had the distinct impression that he was calculating something, her condition, her supplies, the weather, the time remaining before dark, and doing it quickly and accurately. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "The Hale homestead, 8 miles west, roughly. My husband—" She stopped. She had said it out loud several times over the past 11 days, but it still required a breath. "My husband died 11 days ago. The house burned 2 days after. Lightning strike. She kept her chin level. I was heading to town. He did not offer condolences or the kind of social sympathy that would have required her to respond to it and manage his reaction to her grief. He simply absorbed what she had said and moved on to the practical with an efficiency that she found she was deeply, unexpectedly grateful for. "You will not make Elkhorn Crossing tonight," he said. "The temperature will drop another 15 degrees inside an hour. The cloud cover is moving wrong for it to clear." He looked at Biscuit again. "That horse favoring the left front? I got the stone out about an hour ago. Ground is hard and cold. He will stiffen up if you push him." He looked back at her. "I have a cabin 4 miles north. You can shelter there tonight and I will take you to Elkhorn in the morning." Clara looked at him. He was a stranger in the wilderness, and she was alone, and every reasonable instinct she possessed said that she should weigh this carefully. But the wind was rising and her fingers were numb, and there was a baby to consider, and the particular quality of the offer, the blunt, straightforward practicality of it, with no performance of charity in it, no expectation of gratitude she could detect, made her believe in the fast, reliable way that people in genuine danger sometimes believe things, that he was telling the truth. "I don't know your name," she said. "Eli Kane," he said. "Clara Hale." "I know." He looked slightly surprised at her expression. "Thomas Hale came into the trading post at Elkhorn 3 months ago. I was there. He talked about his wife. He said it simply, as a fact. Come on, it will be dark inside 2 hours, and 4 miles is 4 miles. She stood and took Biscuit's rope and followed Eli Kane north through the pines. He had not been exaggerating about the temperature. Within 30 minutes of moving, the cold had taken on a new seriousness, and Clara was grateful for the pace Eli set. Steady, not hurrying her but not dawdling either, threading through the timber on a route that was clearly as familiar to him as walking through a room was to her. He did not talk much. Once he stopped to check a set of tracks in the pine duff. "Deer," he said, without her asking, and once he paused at a creek crossing to make sure Biscuit got across without slipping on the ice-rimmed stones. Both times he acted with the quiet, undemonstrative competence of a man who had spent so long solving problems alone that he had long since stopped thinking of problem-solving as anything other than ordinary life. She studied him when she could without being obvious about it. There was something in the way he moved that was different from men she had known in Pennsylvania, where she had grown up, and different again from Thomas, who had been capable and gentle and entirely dear to her. Eli Kane moved like the country had made him, like the mountains were less a setting he inhabited and more a thing he was genuinely part of, the way the elk were part of it and the pines were part of it. He watched everything, all the time, without any anxiety in it, the sky, the tree line, the ground, and occasionally he would make a small adjustment to their route that she could not have explained, but that always seemed to result in easier ground or better footing. The cabin came into view through the trees just as the light was fully failing. It was a good cabin, not large, but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a small barn attached to the east side, and a wood pile that would have done a family of 6, proud, stacked against the north wall. There was a skin stretched on a frame near the barn door, and the whole place had a neat, functional quality that suggested someone who lived alone, but was not careless about how he lived. Eli got the horses settled and fed before he did anything else, and Clara stood in the barn doorway and watched him work, the lantern casting yellow light across his movements. He rubbed Biscuit down with practiced efficiency and checked the left front hoof a second time, and she found herself oddly moved by the care he took with a horse that was not his. Inside, he built the fire quickly and set water on to boil, and Clara sat at the plain wooden table and felt the warmth begin to work its way back into her fingers, and thought about the fact that she had not eaten a full meal since the day Thomas died. The nausea came and went now, unpredictable, but at the moment she felt only hollow and tired. "I have venison stew from last night," Eli said, hanging his coat on the peg beside the door. In the firelight, with the coat off, the sheer physicality of the man was even more apparent. The wide, hard shoulders beneath his flannel shirt, the way his forearms looked when he pushed up his sleeves to handle the cookpot, the quiet power in his hands. He was perhaps 30, 31, she thought, no more than that, whatever the weathering suggested. "And biscuits. They are day-old." "That sounds perfect," Clara said, and meant it with a wholeness that surprised her. He heated the stew and set it in front of her without ceremony, and she ate. and the stew was good, better than good, seasoned with something she could not identify, rich and dark and warming. She ate all of it and half the biscuits before she stopped and looked up and found him sitting across the table with his own bowl, watching her with an expression she could not read. "Thank you," she said. "This is the first real meal I have managed in several days." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without accusation, just as a statement of fact, "You are not well." It was not the nausea he meant, or not only that. She could tell from the way his eyes had assessed her when he first found her, the same way he had assessed the sky and the temperature and Biscuit's leg. She was pale and thin in a way that went beyond recent grief and recent hard living, and she had been walking too long on too little, and apparently all of that was legible to him. "I am managing," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, quietly and without any strangeness in it, "You are pregnant." She stared at him. She had not said anything. She was barely 2 months along. She was not showing. And yet he had simply said it, the way he said everything, as a plain fact arrived at by straightforward observation. "How did you—" she started. "The way you eat. The color. The way you moved on the trail. Careful in a particular way." He lifted his chin slightly, not unkindly. "I have seen it before." She held herself very still for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I am." He absorbed this with the same quiet equanimity he appeared to bring to most things. He said, "How far along?" 2 months, near as I can reckon." He nodded slowly and looked at the fire. Clara watched his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the dark eyes going steady and thoughtful. And she waited to see what he would do with this information, because it changed things, and she knew it changed things, and she had been aware of that for weeks. "You cannot winter alone in Elkhorn," he said finally. "The boarding house is run by a woman named Mercer. She will not take in a widow who cannot pay full board. I have $43. That will last until December, in the best case." He was not being cruel. He was being the thing she needed someone to be, which was honest. "And then what?" "You will be 4 months along in December. You will not find work in that condition, not in Elkhorn." He paused. "Not in any town within 3 days' ride, most likely." Clara looked at her hands. She had been trying not to follow that line of thought to its natural conclusion, but Eli Kane was apparently a man who had no patience for the kinds of useful self-deception that made hardship bearable in the short term. "I know," she said quietly. "My sister lives in Cheyenne," he said. "She has a house and a husband who is a decent man. She would take you in if I asked." Clara looked up at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the fire, and his expression had the same steady quality it always had. But there was something in the set of his jaw that was different, something that suggested this was not a casual suggestion. "You would send me to your sister," she said slowly. "I would take you," he said. "Cheyenne is 4 days south. The weather will hold another week, maybe 10 days. We could be there before the first real snow." She thought about this. She thought about the $43 in the boarding house and Mrs. Mercer, who she did not know but could easily imagine. She thought about December and February and April and the baby that would arrive sometime in late spring with no father and no home and no plan. "We have never met before tonight," she said. "That is true," he said. "Why would you do this?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned his head and looked at her, and there was something in those dark eyes that was direct and unguarded in a way his face otherwise was not. "Because no one should be alone the way you are alone right now," he said, "and because I can fix it." She could not think of a single thing to say to that. She realized, very close to tears, not from sorrow, but from the specific overwhelm of unexpected kindness when you have been carrying something alone for too long. "Get some sleep," he said, standing. "We will talk in the morning. You can sleep on the bunk. I will take the floor. And before you say anything about that, I have slept on worse." He was already pulling his bedroll from the chest in the corner, and Clara looked at the narrow bunk with its wool blankets and the firelight warm on the rough-hewn walls, and she thought, "All right, just for tonight." And she was asleep within 10 minutes of lying down, the deepest sleep she had managed in 11 days. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of wind against the shutters, and Eli Kane standing at the fire with his back to her, broad shoulders blocking some of the light, stirring something in a pan. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling, and thought about Thomas, the way she did every morning, and let herself feel it, the absence, the specific shape of the hole he had left. And then she set it aside, not because it didn't deserve more, but because she had a child to think about, and a child needed its mother to keep moving. "I will come with you," she said, "to your sisters." He turned from the fire and looked at her. She met his gaze steadily. "I am not asking for charity," she said. "I will work. I am capable of a great deal more than I look right now. I am a good cook, and I can sew, and I kept our accounts, and I can help with children if your sister has them." "She has two," he said, "a boy and a girl." "Then I will be useful." She sat up and smoothed her dress and reached for her boots. "And when the baby comes, I will find a way to be independent. I'm not looking for someone to take care of me permanently. I just need—" She stopped because the word came out quieter than she intended. "I just need somewhere to be for a while." He was quiet. Then he said, "I know." They spent that day preparing for the journey south. Eli had the kind of methodical competence about preparation that made Clara think he had done a great deal of traveling in variable conditions. He packed only what was necessary. He checked everything twice. He made decisions about supplies with the economy of someone who understood exactly how much each item would cost him in terms of weight and space, and how much not having it would cost him in terms of risk. He made Clara eat twice, both times without fuss, just setting food in front of her and going about his business. She found this efficient concern for her well-being easier to accept than explicit attention would have been. They set out the following morning before full light, Eli on his dark horse, a rangy, powerful animal he called Smoke, and Clara on Biscuit, who had rested and was moving easily on all four legs. The sky had cleared overnight and the air was brutally cold but brilliantly clear. The Medicine Bow peaks to the west, brilliant white against a blue that had no warmth in it. Eli took them south along a series of ridges and valleys that he clearly knew intimately, reading the country the way Clara read printed words, quickly, accurately, with the automatic understanding of someone for whom it was simply the native language. They covered good ground that first day, more than Clara had expected. She had worried about her own endurance. The pregnancy had brought with it a fatigue unlike anything she had experienced, a heaviness in her bones that no amount of sleep seemed to fully resolve. But Eli paced the travel well, stopping at midday at a creek to water the horses and eat, insisting without drama that she rest for a full 30 minutes before they continued. She noticed that he ate less than she did at those stops, and she suspected he was giving her the larger portion without making any point of it. At the end of the first day, they made camp in the shelter of a sandstone bluff, and Eli built a fire with the efficient speed of someone who has built 1,000 fires and made coffee and fried the last of the salt pork he had brought from the cabin. The stars over Wyoming were extraordinary. She had forgotten that, in the weeks of grief and crisis, how the sky out here was simply bigger than any sky she had known back east, layered with stars so dense they looked structural rather than decorative. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "In Wyoming, I mean." 7 years, he said. He was sitting across the fire from her, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Came up from Colorado after the war work dried up. Intended to trap for a season and ended up staying." "What keeps you here?" she asked, and immediately felt the question was too personal, but he did not seem to mind it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. Then he said, "It's honest. The country." He glanced up at the stars. "What you see is what it is. No pretense to it." He looked at her. "Back east, everything has layers. What people mean is never what people say. Out here, the danger is real danger. The cold is real cold. It's—" He seemed to reach for a word he didn't usually need. "Cleaner." She understood this better than she would have before coming west with Thomas. She had lived her whole life up to age 20 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and she'd been perfectly content there. And then she had come here and discovered that she had not actually understood how much space a person could have, or how much silence, or how those two things could do something to your chest that was frightening and necessary at once. "Thomas felt the same way," she said softly. Eli nodded. He did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, "Tell me about him, if you want to." She looked at him over the fire. He was watching her with those level, dark eyes, and there was nothing uncomfortable in the invitation, no performance of wanting to hear it, no tactical social interest. He was simply offering her the space to speak about Thomas because he had correctly assessed that she had not been able to do that. Not since the burial. Everyone in Elkhorn had been kind in the awkward way of people who do not know what to say and so say very little. So she told him. She told him about meeting Thomas in Lancaster at a church social, how he had been there with his brother and had spent the whole evening talking to her about the land agent's pamphlets he had been reading about the Wyoming Territory, his eyes alive with a particular enthusiasm that she had found instantly compelling. She told him about the year they had planned and saved before coming west, and the journey out by rail and then wagon, and the first sight of the mountains that had made them both completely silent. She told him about building the house together, the two of them and a neighbor who came to help for the first 2 weeks, how Thomas had put in the windowsills crooked and been so embarrassed about it that she had pretended not to notice until one evening she had laughed about it, and then he had laughed too, and they had laughed until they couldn't breathe. She told him about the apple tree. She talked for a long time, and Eli listened, and the fire burned down and the stars wheeled overhead, and by the time she finished, she felt lighter in a way that was hard to account for, not better exactly, not less grieved, but less compressed, as if the weight of it was now distributed into the air around her rather than concentrated entirely in her chest. "He sounds like a good man," Eli said. "He was," she said, and then, with a certainty that surprised her, "He would have liked you." Eli smiled then, a small, contained smile, but genuine, and it changed his face considerably, briefly, in the way that smiles change the faces of people who don't use them as performance. They traveled for 3 days through country that shifted from the high sage flats of the Laramie Basin to the foothills, and then to the wider, flatter land north of Cheyenne. The weather held, cold and clear. Each day fell into a rhythm: early start, midday rest, camp before dark. And Clara found herself becoming accustomed to Eli's way of moving through the world, which was so at odds with everything she had grown up with and yet felt, in some way she could not explain, more natural than anything she had known. He did not talk unless there was something to say, but he was never closed off or distant. He watched her constantly, in the careful, unobtrusive way that suggested he was simply making sure she was all right, and when she was not all right, when the nausea came, when the fatigue hit her suddenly at midday on the 3rd day and she nearly swayed in the saddle, he responded immediately and practically. No fuss, just a hand on Biscuit's bridle and a suggestion that they stop and her dignity perfectly intact and 30 minutes in the shade of a cottonwood grove while she collected herself. On the 3rd night, camped beside a creek with the lights of Cheyenne just barely visible as a glow to the south, he asked her about the baby. Not intrusively, he had not asked about it since the first night, had simply worked the fact of it into his practical calculations the way he worked weather and terrain into them. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She had been watching the creek where ice had formed at the edges. She thought about the question honestly. "Yes and no," she said. "I was frightened before Thomas died. It seemed enormous, becoming a mother. And then he died. And everything was frightening, and so the baby stopped being particularly frightening in comparison." She paused. "And then somewhere in the last few days I realized that the baby is the only thing I have left of the life we were building. And so the fear shifted into something else." He was quiet. "Love," she said, and her voice was steady and sure. "The fear shifted into love. I think that is what happened." He turned his head and looked at her, and in the firelight, his expression held something she had not seen there before, something that was not practical assessment or careful competence, but something more open than that, more unguarded. "That's a good thing," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. Cheyenne, in October of 1878, was a city in the particular way that Wyoming cities were cities, rough at the edges but with genuine ambition at its core, the railroads having turned it from a tent camp into something with real brick buildings and a main street and aspirations. It was noisy and busy in a way that felt, after 4 days of open country, slightly overwhelming, and Clara gripped Biscuit's reins a little tighter as they rode down the main thoroughfare. Eli's sister was named Margaret, and she lived in a frame house on a quiet street 2 blocks from the railroad depot. She was a year younger than Eli, dark-eyed and dark-haired like him, but with a warmth that was immediately visible and immediately genuine. She opened the door when they arrived and looked at her brother, and then at Clara, and then at the trunk strapped to Biscuit's back, and she absorbed the situation in about 4 seconds. "Come in," she said, in exactly the tone that meant, "I will hear all of this and it will be all right." Her husband was James Beaumont, a solid, quiet man who worked for one of the railroad land offices and treated Eli with the straightforward respect of a man who has decided he will simply defer to his wife's family's judgment and has never had occasion to regret that decision. He shook Clara's hand and showed her to the guest room and asked no questions. Margaret fed them both and listened to the abbreviated version of the story. Thomas, the fever, the fire, the walking, Eli finding her in the pines, and she looked at her brother across the table with an expression that Clara could not entirely read. Eli looked back at her with the studied neutrality of a man who has older sisters and knows when he's being assessed. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked Clara directly. "Better than I was," Clara said honestly. "Your brother has been very kind." Margaret looked at Eli again. He examined his coffee cup. Clara stayed in the guest room that first night and slept 12 hours without moving, and in the morning she felt more like herself than she had since the fever took Thomas. She came downstairs to find Margaret alone in the kitchen, the children, a boy of 5 named William and a girl of 3 named Ruth, at the table eating oatmeal. "Eli has gone to the stockyard," Margaret said. "He will be back this evening." She poured Clara coffee without asking and set it down. "Sit down. Let me look at you." Clara sat. Margaret looked at her with the frank, assessing gaze that ran in the family, and then nodded, apparently satisfied with something. "You are stronger than you look right now," Margaret said, "and you will be stronger still once you have eaten regularly for a few weeks." She sat down across from her. "I want you to stay here as long as you need to. Eli explained your situation. You are welcome in this house." "I don't want to be a burden," Clara started. "You are not a burden," Margaret said, with the same blunt directness her brother used. "You are a young woman who is pregnant and who lost her husband and her home in the same 2 weeks, and you have managed all of it with what I can only describe as remarkable composure. And you are going to let me help you." She leaned forward slightly. "All right?" Clara felt the burn of real tears for the first time in weeks. She pressed them back. "All right," she said. Eli returned that evening with news that he had arranged for Biscuit to be stabled properly and that there was a doctor in Cheyenne he thought Clara should see before too many more days passed. He delivered this information at the supper table in the same even tone he used for everything, and Clara found herself watching him across the table, the way he talked with William, who had clearly decided that his uncle was the most interesting thing in the world and wanted to show him everything immediately. The way he answered the boys' endless questions with the same patience he applied to everything, the way he ate Margaret's cooking with genuine appreciation, the way his eyes came to Clara's occasionally across the table with that steady, checking quality that she had come to associate entirely with him. Over the following weeks, Clara settled into the Beaumont house with a practicality that she hoped justified Margaret's faith in her. She helped with the children, with the cooking, with the mending. Margaret had a mountain of mending, the inevitable condition of a household with 2 small children and a husband who worked with his hands. She kept the accounts, which Margaret turned over to her with evident relief after discovering that Clara's head for numbers was considerably better than her own. She went to the doctor, who confirmed what she already knew, put her at 8 weeks and said she was in reasonable health considering everything, and needed to eat more and rest more and worry less. The last of which he said with the kind of cheerful prescription that suggested he did not fully appreciate the scope of things she currently had to worry about. She told Eli about the appointment when he came to supper that night. He had been staying at the hotel 2 streets over rather than imposing on James and Margaret, but he came for supper most evenings in a way that had become simply part of the household's rhythm without anyone formally establishing it. 8 weeks, she said, so the baby should come in late May or early June. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said carefully, "What is your plan for after?" She had been thinking about this. "I want to stay in Wyoming," she said. I have the land, the homestead. It is still ours, legally. The house burned, but the land is ours." Thomas filed the claim properly. She looked at her hands. "I know that sounds impossible given everything, but I don't want to go back east. I don't want to give up what he... She stopped, because the sentence had more than one ending, and she was not sure which one was honest. "What you were both building," Eli said quietly. "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Margaret, who was washing dishes at the basin, was being very industrious about it and not looking at either of them. "The land claim is solid," Eli said finally. 8 months of improvements before the fire. The foundation is still there. With lumber from the mill in Laramie, it would not be hard to build again in the spring." He looked at her. "There is good water on that land, and the grass in the lower meadow is better than anything I have seen in the basin." Clara looked at him. He was looking at the table, his large hands flat on the wood, and she realized that he was talking about the land the way he had talked about Wyoming itself, with the particular care of someone who did not waste words or emotion on things he was not genuinely invested in. "Eli," she said. He looked up. "What are you saying?" she asked. He met her eyes. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet that she had learned to recognize as him choosing words with unusual care. "I am saying," he said slowly, "that the land is good and it should not go to waste, and that a woman alone with a baby in the spring cannot work it alone, and that I have been in the Wyoming Territory for 7 years, and I have a cabin that is adequate for one person, but that is not—" He stopped, tried again. "I am saying that I have been thinking about this for 3 weeks, since the first night." Margaret had completely abandoned the pretense of washing dishes. Clara looked at the man across the table, this large, quiet, mountain-shaped man who had found her in the pines and fed her venison stew and listened to her talk about Thomas by a fire and checked her horse's hooves and ridden 4 days south in October because she needed somewhere to be. And she felt something shift in her chest. Not the grief shifting. Something else. Something new that had been growing quietly alongside the grief, the way plants grow quietly in cold weather, close to the ground before the warmth comes. "I think you need to say it plainly," she said, "because I am very tired of guessing at things." A corner of his mouth moved. "I'm asking if you would let me court you," he said, "properly, with the understanding that there is no rushing it and no pressure to it, and that the baby is not a complication but the opposite of that, with the understanding that you are still grieving and that I am not asking you to stop." He looked at her steadily. "And with the understanding that if the answer is no, you are still welcome here, and I will still help you get back to your land in the spring, and there will be nothing owed and nothing awkward." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The answer is not no." His whole face changed, not dramatically. He was not a man of dramatic expressions, but there was a warmth in those dark eyes that she had only glimpsed before, something that opened like a door into a room she had not known existed in him. "All right then," he said. "All right then," she agreed. Behind them, Margaret went back to washing dishes with considerably more energy than the task required. The courtship was genuine and unhurried in a way that suited both of them. He brought her books from the lending library in town. She had mentioned once that she loved to read, and he had not forgotten, and they read in the evenings by the fire, sometimes aloud to each other, and talked about what they read in the way that people talk when they are genuinely interested in knowing how the other person thinks. He walked with her in the afternoons when the weather was decent, and she learned the city the way he had learned the mountains, slowly and on foot with someone who knew it already. He talked more than she had expected, once the context was there for talking. He had opinions, careful and interesting ones, about land use and water rights and the railroad companies and the treatment of the Arapaho, and he expressed them with the same directness that characterized everything about him. She told him once, in early November on a walk along the edge of the city where it dissolved into open country, that she had not expected him to have so many thoughts. He looked at her sideways. "Did you expect me to grunt and point at things?" She laughed, a real laugh, loud and unguarded, and he smiled the contained, genuine smile she had come to look forward to as one of the better things in a given day. "No," she said when she had recovered. "I think I expected The quiet. I thought the quiet was all of it. The quiet is where I keep everything, he said, until there is somewhere to put it. She thought about that for a long time afterward. In November, she felt the pregnancy begin to announce itself more visibly, and with the visibility came a new physical reality. She was more tired by afternoon, and her back ached in a persistent, unremarkable way, and the nausea had mostly resolved, but food had become a complicated subject of its own. Margaret was invaluable during this period, having navigated 2 pregnancies herself and having the practical knowledge that no doctor could provide and no book quite captured. She taught Clara what to eat when nothing sounded right and what to do about the back ache and how to sleep without waking every hour. And she did all of this with the same matter-of-fact warmth that made the Beaumont house feel more like home than Clara had expected any place to feel so soon. Eli was attentive in his own way. He did not treat her differently because of the pregnancy, which she appreciated. He did not become overly solicitous or assume she needed to be managed. But he watched for the things she would not ask for help with, and he provided them before she had to ask. And she found this quality in him, this specific attentiveness to the needs she was not advertising, to be among the most quietly affecting things she had ever encountered in another person. One evening in late November, she was sitting by the fire reading, and he came and sat beside her rather than across from her, which he had not done before. He said nothing, just settled there with his own book, and the warmth and solidity of him was immediately palpable, and she thought about moving away, and then thought about not moving away, and did not move away. They sat together reading for 2 hours, and did not speak much, and it was one of the nicest evenings she could remember. When he left that night at the door, he said quietly, "I would like to kiss you, when you are ready." She looked up at him. He was so tall, filling the doorframe, the cold air coming in from outside, bringing with it the smell of snow. His face was serious and patient. "I'm not sure when ready will be," she said honestly. "That's fine," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I would like to." She went upstairs and lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, and felt many things simultaneously, and among them was something that felt very much like wanting. December brought the real cold, and with it a changed quality to everything. The city contracted into itself, the streets quieter, the evenings longer. Eli could not make the trip back to his cabin in the mountains in December, which was both practical reality and also something else, something that neither of them stated directly, but that they were both aware of. He extended his stay at the hotel and came to the Beaumont house every day, and gradually the daily visits became a thing that Clara organized her days around, in the way you organize days around things that matter. They were decorating the house for Christmas, William having strong opinions about the placement of every pine bough and candle, when Clara found herself standing on a chair trying to reach the top of the window frame with a length of ribbon, and Eli came up behind her and said, "Give me that," in a tone that was not quite scolding but definitely expressed an opinion about chairs and pregnant women, and she turned and handed him the ribbon, and he reached up and secured it easily, and then turned and looked at her, still on the chair, which put their eyes at the same level for once. She kissed him. It was her doing. She'd not planned it, but there they were, level with each other for once, and his face was right there, and the warmth and the pine smell and the firelight and something that had been building for 2 months simply arrived at its natural conclusion. She kissed him, and he went still for half a second and then kissed her back, and it was the kind of kiss that quiet people give when they have been waiting, thorough and sure and with no performance about it, just absolute sincerity. When she pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, open and unguarded and genuinely undone, just briefly. "I thought you weren't sure when ready would be," he said. "I changed my mind," she said. "I do that sometimes." "Good," he said, and he helped her down from the chair. William, from across the room, said loudly that they were doing the ribbons wrong and could they please pay attention, and they both laughed. Christmas in the Beaumont house was the first time Clara had felt genuinely celebratory since Thomas's death, and she was surprised by it, surprised that she could feel it, that joy could exist alongside grief without canceling it out, that they could simply occupy the same space in her chest, like 2 different kinds of weather. She sat at the Christmas table with the Beaumonts and Eli, and watched the candles and listened to William describe at length the extraordinary greatness of the gift he had received, which was a toy horse, and she felt the baby move for the very first time, a small interior flutter like a moth against glass. She put her hand to her abdomen, and Eli, sitting beside her, saw. "Is it?" he started. "Moving," she said. "Just now. For the first time." His expression went very still and very quiet, and then he reached over and covered her hand with his. Just for a moment, just briefly, his large, scarred hand warm over hers, and then he removed his hand and picked up his fork and said something ordinary, and she thought her heart might break open with how much she felt in that moment. She told him in January that she was in love with him. She did not plan to say it then. They were walking the road out of town in the snow, the bare cottonwoods on either side white and beautiful against the sky. And they had been talking about the spring and the plans for the land, and he was describing where he thought they should position the new house relative to the creek, and she was listening to his voice, steady and sure, talking about a future that included them in it as a matter of fact, and she simply said it. "I love you, Eli." He stopped walking. He turned and looked at her, and the snow was falling lightly, and his dark hair had snowflakes in it, and his face, that serious, weathered, angular face, held something that was pure and simple and entirely honest. "I know," he said quietly. "I have been in love with you since the night I found you in the pines." "That was the first night we met," she said. "Yes," he said, as if this were not remarkable. "You cannot fall in love with someone the first night," she said. "I cannot tell you anything else that is true," he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the falling snow, and then she said, "Marry me." His eyebrows rose. "I was going to ask you." "You were taking too long," she said. Something flashed in his eyes, amusement and something richer and deeper than that. He reached out and took her face in his two large, careful hands, and he kissed her in the snow on the road outside Cheyenne, Wyoming, in January of 1879, thoroughly and without any reserve at all. "Yes," he said, against her lips. "Obviously, yes." They were married on the 14th of February, 1879, in a simple ceremony at the small church 2 streets from the Beaumont house, with Margaret and James as witnesses, and William holding the ring with the intense concentration of a 5-year-old who understands that this is a significant responsibility. The minister was a practical man of the frontier variety who kept the service brief and warm, and Eli stood at the front of the church in his good coat, which was not very good but was clean and pressed. And when Clara came down the short aisle in the blue dress Margaret had helped her alter to accommodate her 7 months pregnant figure, his face was the most open she had ever seen it, unguarded entirely, just him looking at her with everything visible. She felt enormous, she felt radiant, she felt both these things at once, which Margaret had assured her was entirely normal. She reached him and he took her hand, and the minister began. And outside the window the February wind was blowing snow against the glass, and inside the church it was warm and bright. "I do," she said when it was her turn, and she meant it in every direction, not the simple declaration of the moment, but the whole weight of it, the future she was choosing, the man she was choosing, the life she was choosing to keep building even after the first version of it had burned. "I do," he said, and his voice was even and sure, and his hand was warm and strong around hers. After the ceremony they had cake at the Beaumont house, and William was given an extra piece for his sterling ring-bearing work, and Margaret cried in the way of a woman who is very happy and not in the least embarrassed about it. And James shook Eli's hand and said something quiet that made Eli's face go quiet and moved in return. The evening was warm and simple and good. Their wedding night was spent in the hotel room Eli had maintained throughout the winter, which Margaret had quietly ensured was stocked with extra wood for the fire and a vase of the paper flowers she had made because there were no real ones in February in Wyoming. It was both more awkward and more natural than Clara had expected. The particular combination of genuine love and physical unfamiliarity and the very considerable reality of a 7 months pregnant body between them, and they navigated it with care and a fair amount of quiet laughter. And when they finally lay together in the dark with the fire burning low, her back against his chest, His arm around her and his hand resting gently against the round of her abdomen, she felt a peace that she had not expected to feel again. Complete, like something that had been broken and remade into a different shape that was nonetheless whole. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly, his voice low in the dark. "About the windowsills," she said. A pause. "The windowsills. At the new house, I want them straight. Thomas put ours in crooked and I never told him, and now I think about it and I wish I had told him so we could have laughed about it." She was quiet for a moment. "I want straight windowsills." His arm tightened around her slightly. "I will put in the straightest windowsills you have ever seen," he said. She smiled in the dark. "Good. Clara?" "Yes. I'm going to be a good father to this child," he said. "I want you to know that. I have thought about it, and I'm certain of it." She turned within the circle of his arm so she could see his face in the firelight, and she looked at him for a long moment, the serious eyes, the jaw, the whole steady, solid presence of him. "I know," she said. "I've been certain of it for months." He looked back at her, and the warmth in his eyes was something she thought she could spend a very long time looking at. Spring came to Cheyenne slowly, and then all at once, the way spring always comes to that part of Wyoming. Weeks of cold that suddenly break on a particular morning and everything begins, the ground softening, the cottonwoods greening, the light changing quality overnight. In March, Eli rode north to his cabin to retrieve what he wanted to keep and to look at the Hale land and assess what would be needed. He was gone for 2 weeks, which were the longest 2 weeks of Clara's life since Thomas's death. And when he came back, she was waiting on the Beaumont porch, and she stood up when she saw him coming down the street on Smoke, and he swung down before the horse had fully stopped, and she walked to meet him, and he held her carefully, all that careful strength accounting for the baby that was now 3 weeks from arriving, and she set his name into his shoulder and felt everything settle back into its right position. "The land is good," he said into her hair. "The creek ran all winter. There's still one wall of the barn standing, the north one. We can build around it." He pulled back to look at her. "There's a stand of timber on the western slope with enough good logs for a full house. I know a man in Laramie who has a sawmill." "Straight windowsills," she reminded him. He was smiling. "Straight windowsills," he confirmed. The baby came on the 14th of May, 1879, during a thunderstorm that rolled down from the Medicine Bow Peaks and rattled every window in the Beaumont house. It was a hard labor, longer than the doctor had predicted, and Clara was grateful beyond words for Margaret, who never left her side, and for the doctor, who was steady and capable, and for Eli, who sat outside the bedroom door for 8 hours with the patience of a man who had waited out many hard things and trusted them to resolve. When the doctor came out finally and said, "You have a son," Eli stood up from the chair so fast it scraped back against the wall. He went in, and Clara was exhausted and pale, and holding a red, small, furious person who had not yet decided whether the world was worth the effort, and she looked up at Eli, and the look on his face was something she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not complicated. It was simple, direct, and completely without defense, love immediate and total and already certain. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and she lifted the baby slightly, and he put his arm around her shoulders and looked at this child, this new person who was Thomas's and hers and also now his in all the ways that mattered, and he was quiet for a long time. "He has your eyes," he said finally. Clara looked at the baby. The baby's eyes were the unfocused, uncertain blue-gray of all newborns, belonging to no one yet. "You cannot possibly tell that," she said. "I can tell," Eli said. She rested her head against his shoulder. "We need to name him." They had discussed this. They had talked about it in the evenings, going back and forth, and had not quite arrived at a decision. Now she looked at the baby and thought about what a person needed to carry into the world they were going to live in. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Eli Kane." He went very still beside her. "If that is all right," she said. He turned his head and looked at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had only seen once before, on their wedding day. "That is more than all right," he said quietly. Thomas Eli Kane screamed his opinion of the world at regular intervals for the first 3 months of his life, and Clara thought she had never been so tired, and she thought she had never been so happy, and both of these things were simply equally true. Eli was exactly what he had promised to be, a good father, careful and steady and completely present. He learned quickly and without any embarrassment about not knowing, how to hold the baby, how to settle him when he was fussing, how to read the different registers of his crying. He would walk the baby in the evenings, the enormous man and the small, furious child, moving slowly around whatever room they were in, talking quietly about whatever he was thinking about, which was usually the land or the weather or something Clara had said that he had been turning over. In June, when the baby was 4 weeks old, they traveled north in a wagon Eli had bought and fitted out for the journey, comfortable, with good canvas, with the extra supplies they would need. Margaret cried when they left, and Clara held her for a long time, and William told baby Thomas sternly that he should visit often. James shook Eli's hand and said again the quiet thing he said that made Eli's face go quiet in response. The land was everything Eli had described, and everything Clara remembered from those first 8 months with Thomas. The creek ran clear and cold from the mountains, and the lower meadow was deep in spring grass, and the one standing barn wall rose solid and weathered against the sky, and the view of the Medicine Bow peaks from the slight rise above the creek was simply staggering, massive and white and ancient, indifferent to everything human, and therefore endlessly reassuring. They set up the tent first, and then Eli began the house. He worked with a neighbor, a quiet Norwegian named Halvorsen, who had been a carpenter in Oslo before the world redirected him to Wyoming, and they worked steadily through June and July, and the house rose log by log and timber by timber, and Clara kept the records and cooked for the workers and nursed Thomas and watched the mountains and felt the days accumulate into something solid and lasting. The house was finished in August. It was not large, but it was sound and warm, with 3 rooms downstairs and a loft above, and a porch that faced east into the morning sun, and windowsills that were, she checked with the level herself, unable to entirely stop herself, perfectly straight. She stood in the main room with the baby on her hip, and looked at the walls and the fire and the window light coming in straight and level, and she felt the 2 versions of this life she had lived, the one with Thomas, building toward something, and the one she was living now, the thing built and standing. And she felt the grief and the gratitude occupying the same space again, each real and each complete. Eli came in from outside, brushing sawdust from his shirt, and she turned and looked at him and thought, "This man is my home now. This man, and this child, and this land, and the mountains through that window." "Well," he said. "The windowsills are perfect," she said. He laughed, a real, full laugh, which was still rare enough to be wonderful every time it happened, and crossed the room and kissed her, and Thomas Eli Kane expressed his opinion of being squashed between his parents by making a sound of extreme inconvenience. Life on the land established its rhythms over the following years with the accumulation of small, significant things. The apple tree they planted the first spring, Clara had kept one of the seedlings from Thomas's apple tree, wrapped carefully in wet burlap for the journey, grew steadily against the east side of the porch, its roots going deeper as the seasons turned, its branches reaching wider with each year. The horses multiplied. The root cellar was dug and stocked, the garden produced in expanding abundance, as Clara learned the altitude and the soil and the short growing season with the same patient attention she brought to everything. Thomas Eli grew from a screaming, furious newborn into a round, solemn toddler who watched the world with large, dark eyes that were, Eli was right in the end, exactly Clara's eyes. He developed strong opinions about horses at the age of 2.5, which Eli encouraged to the extent that before the boy could walk steadily without falling, he could already name every horse in the corral and had clear favorites. By 3, he was being led around the yard on the gentlest of them, sitting upright with an expression of fierce concentration that was his father's expression exactly, which still made Clara's chest ache in the best possible way. The winter of their second year on the land brought the kind of cold that tested everything. 3 weeks of temperatures that froze the creek solid from bank to bank and kept the horses in the barn and reduced the world to the distance between the house and the woodpile. They were prepared for it, better prepared than most, because Eli had been living through Wyoming winters for 7 years and had very few illusions about what they required. The woodpile was immense, the larder was full. The house was tight against the wind. They spent those 3 weeks closer than they had ever been, the closeness of people sealed together by weather with no alternative but to discover whether they could bear it. They could. They bore it easily, and more than that. The winter was one of the richest periods Clara could remember. The long evenings by the fire, with the wind outside, and the baby asleep in the loft, and the books and the conversation, and the particular peace of being warm and well supplied and with someone you trusted completely. She told him one night, watching the fire with Thomas sleeping and the wind rattling the glass, "I never expected this." He knew what she meant. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Neither did I." She looked at him. "Does it scare you? How much you—" She gestured at the room, at everything it contained. "Yes," he said, simply and honestly. "Every day. I was not afraid of anything for a long time, and now I'm afraid of everything. You. Him. This." He looked at her. "It is the right kind of afraid." She reached over and took his hand, his large, scarred hand, and he turned it and held hers, and they sat like that watching the fire for a long time without needing anything else. Spring of 1881 brought another baby. Clara was not surprised. She'd suspected for a month before she said anything, and she told Eli on a morning in April, when the apple tree was just beginning to bud, sitting on the porch steps with her coffee, Thomas building something complicated in the dirt a few feet away. Eli received the news the way he received most things, with a brief stillness and then a shift in his face that was the opposite of concealment, and then he sat down beside her on the porch steps and looked at the mountains for a moment. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better than last time, I think," she said. "Less frightened, more tired somehow." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and Thomas looked up from his construction and said, "Papa, look," and showed them whatever he had built, and Eli said, "That is excellent," with complete sincerity, and Clara laughed and thought, this, all of this. All of this was what she had been walking toward in the pines that cold October, not knowing it, with no strength left to argue against anything. The second child was a boy, born in November of 1881 in the house they had built, in the room with the straight windowsills, with the same doctor from Cheyenne now making the journey because he had become their doctor, and because Margaret Beaumont had considerable influence over him. They named him James, for the man who had shaken Eli's hand twice in ways that meant something. James Kane came into the world red-faced and loud, the opposite of his quiet parents, full of opinion from the first hour. And Thomas, now 2.5, regarded him from a safe distance with the careful skepticism of someone assessing a new and uncertain development. By the time James was a year old, Thomas had decided his brother was acceptable and possibly even interesting, and they were frequently found together in the dirt near the apple tree, engaged in projects whose purpose was not always apparent to adults, but seemed to carry considerable weight. Eli had, by the winter of 1882, become known in the county as the man you went to when something difficult needed to be done. Not in the official capacities of sheriffs and deputies and land agents. He had no interest in those, but in the practical, essential way that certain men in frontier country become the fixed point other people orient around. He knew the land better than anyone in 3 counties. He knew the weather and the water and the ways things failed and how to fix them. He was fair without being soft and direct without being cruel, and men who needed those things in someone sought him out, and he helped them and asked nothing for it, and did not particularly think of it as anything other than ordinary. Clara watched this happen over the years with the particular pride of someone who knew things about a person that the world did not see. She knew that he had nightmares sometimes, that the war work in Colorado he had mentioned once and never elaborated on had left residue in him. She knew that he was genuinely, tenderly moved by beauty in specific private ways, a hawk turning in a thermal above the meadow, the way the mountains looked at first light, Thomas's drawings, which were all horses. She knew that he loved her with the same completeness and certainty he had described on their wedding night, and that it did not diminish with years, but settled into something that was less dramatic and more absolute, the way all real things eventually become less dramatic and more absolute. She loved him in the same way. She had stopped thinking about it as a surprise or a coincidence, the way it had happened. The fire and the fever and the pines and this enormous quiet man finding her and saying with no ceremony at all, "You are coming with me." She had stopped thinking of her life as divided into the before and the after, because the years had blurred that division into something that was simply her life, whole and continuous, with grief in it and joy in it and love in very large amounts. The apple tree bore fruit in the 4th year, not much, a dozen small apples, tart and imperfect. But Clara brought them inside and made a pie, and they ate it at the table with Thomas and James, and she thought about Thomas Hale's tree beside the other house, the one that burned, and she thought, he would be glad. She knew this with the uncomplicated certainty of the grieved who have come far enough through grief to see clearly. He would be glad. She told Eli this later, lying in the dark with the fire banked and the children asleep. "I think he would be glad," she said. "I think he would have liked you. I told you that the first night I ever met you." "I remember," he said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "I think about him sometimes. When Thomas, our Thomas, does something particularly himself, I think about the boy who built things a certain way, what he would have made of a son like that." She felt the familiar warm ache in her chest that was Thomas Hale's memory, still present, still cared for. "He would have been very proud," she said. "Yes," Eli said, "so am I." She turned in the dark and found his face by feel, and she kissed him with all the accumulated years of it, and he kissed her back. And outside the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and magnificent, and exactly what it had always been. In the summer of 1883, a woman arrived in the valley, a young woman, 20 years old, traveling alone from Nebraska on a situation that bore some resemblance to Clara's own arrival in the territory 5 years before. She came to the Kane place on a recommendation from Halverson, who had heard from someone in Elkhorn that Eli Kane was a man you could trust. Her name was Rose, and she was 3 months pregnant and recently abandoned by a man who had gone further west without her, and she was thin and frightened in a way that Clara recognized with complete, immediate recognition. She put Rose in the guest room without asking Eli's opinion, though she knew he would have done the same thing. She fed her and let her sleep, and did not ask questions until Rose was ready to answer them. Eli, when he came in and found a stranger at the table, took in the situation. In the same 4 seconds his sister took in situations, and he sat down and poured coffee and talked to Rose about the weather until she stopped looking like she might bolt. "This is what we do," Clara told him that evening, in the kitchen while Rose played with James, who had decided she was fascinating. "People come here who need somewhere to be." He looked at her across the kitchen, and the look was full of the particular warmth she knew was his love for her, direct and unembellished. "I know," he said. "I started it." She threw the dish towel at him. Rose stayed through the winter, and in January she delivered a daughter, and she named her Clara, which made the original Clara cry in a way she had not expected, and was slightly embarrassed about. Rose stayed until spring, and then moved on to Cheyenne, to Margaret, who had by then helped so many women transition from crisis to capability that it had become a kind of unofficial practice. Margaret had strong opinions about this not being remarkable. Eli, when Clara told him about what Margaret did in Cheyenne, had the look of a man who was not surprised in the least. By 1884, the Kane homestead had become one of the established places in the Laramie Basin. Not wealthy, not grand, but solid and known and trusted. They had 23 horses, a good garden, an expanding orchard, now that Clara had learned what she was doing with fruit trees in high altitude, and a house that had been added to twice as the family grew. Thomas was 5 and already riding independently, which Eli had permitted with the particular combination of pride and caution that the parents of fearless children navigate constantly. James was 3 and loud about his opinions and the delight of everyone who met him. The third baby, a girl, finally, though Clara had told Eli that she had no preference and meant it, came in the summer of 1884, born on a warm July night with the windows open and the smell of the mountains in the room. They named her Margaret for the obvious reason, and she was dark-haired and dark-eyed, and from the first day of her life looked at the world with an expression of thorough assessment that was entirely her father's. "She looks just like you," Clara told Eli on the morning after, watching him hold the baby with the same careful gravity he had brought to holding each of them. "She looks like you," he said. "She has your eyes. She's already assessing me and finding me inadequate." He looked at her and the smile came, that contained whole, genuine smile. "She has your backbone," he said. "I can already tell." "God help us all," Clara said. He laughed. The years settled into the particular richness of a life that is doing what it is supposed to do. There were hard years. A drought in 1886 that tested the creek in the garden and required Eli to travel further into the mountains than usual for reliable water. And a winter in 1887 that recalled the 3-week deep freeze of 1882 and kept them all close to the fire again for the better part of 6 weeks. Thomas Hale's namesake, at 7, developed a chest cold during the long winter of 87 that laid him up for 2 weeks and frightened Clara more than she admitted to Eli, who knew anyway. But the child was strong, and the cold passed, and by March he was running in the mud outside the barn, making his brother and sister miserable with the particular energy of a recovered child. There were good years too, bright years that accumulated like interest on the investment of all the hard ones. The summer of 1885, when the meadow grass came in thick and the horses were the best they had ever raised, and Eli sold a string of 5 to the army at Fort Laramie at a price that let them buy the extra land to the south that backed onto the timber line. The summer of 1889, when Wyoming became a state, and there were celebrations in Elkhorn and in Laramie and in Cheyenne, and Eli stood on the porch with Thomas and James and explained what it meant with the careful seriousness he brought to important things. And Clara stood in the doorway with Margaret on her hip and watched this man she had married explain the world to their children and felt the particular, enormous, undramatic joy of a life that is working. Margaret Beaumont came to visit every summer, making the journey from Cheyenne by rail to Laramie and then by stage to Elkhorn. She spoiled the children systematically and without apology, and argued politics with Eli over supper, and told Clara, privately, every visit, that she had never seen her brother as happy as he was, and that she took no credit for it whatsoever, and that Clara was entirely responsible, and that this was the finest thing in the world. "He found me," Clara always said. "He found you," Margaret agreed. "He always did know where to look." William and Ruth came with Margaret in the summer of 1890. William now 16 and already tall in the Beaumont way. Ruth at 14 already her mother's daughter in all the best particulars. They spent 2 weeks at the Kane place, and William and Thomas, the respective oldest children, formed an immediate alliance based on horses and a shared willingness to get into impressive amounts of trouble, which their fathers regarded with exasperation and their mothers regarded with amusement. The older Thomas was always present at these family summers, in the way that the dead are present when they are properly remembered. Clara kept a small photograph of Thomas Hale on the mantelpiece, the only one she had, taken in Lancaster before they left for Wyoming, young and serious and bright-eyed. She had explained it to her children when they were old enough to understand. This was the man whose name their oldest brother carried, who had loved her and built a life with her and planted an apple tree and died too soon in the Wyoming Territory in the 2nd year of their dream. They understood without being weighted by it, the way children understand the history they have been given with honesty and care. Thomas Eli, at 10, had stood in front of the photograph for a long time one winter evening and then asked, "Did you love him the same as Papa?" Clara had been folding laundry and she put it down and thought about this question seriously because it deserved serious thought. "I loved him the way the person I was then loved him," she said. "And I love your Papa the way the person I am now loves him. They are not the same kind of love because I am not the same person, but they are both real." Thomas Eli thought about this for a while. Then he said, "That makes sense," in the tone of someone who has resolved something and went back to whatever he had been doing. Eli, who had been in the kitchen and had heard, came to the doorway and looked at her. She looked back. He said nothing. She said nothing. They had been married 11 years by then, and there were whole conversations that required no words. In the winter of 1891, Eli was injured. A tree-felling accident in the timber above the western slope, a glancing blow from a falling trunk that broke 2 ribs and cracked a third and left him in bed for 3 weeks. He was, predictably, a terrible patient, not because he was difficult, but because he was constitutionally incapable of understanding why he should not get up and do things. Clara ran the place with Thomas's help. The boy was 12 now, and capable, more capable than she gave him credit for, until the moment when she had to rely on it and found it completely solid. And she sat with Eli in the evenings and read to him because his ribs made it painful to hold a book. And she told him every day in various ways that he was not allowed to die because she had already done that, and once was enough. "I am not dying," he said with some irritation. "I have broken ribs." "I am establishing a policy," she said. His mouth moved. "You and your policies. They keep things in order." He looked at her from the pillow, still imposing despite the bed rest, still taking up more space than seemed entirely reasonable, and his dark eyes were warm and direct and entirely his. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "Come here." She set down the book and moved to sit on the edge of the bed beside him, and he reached up and took her hand, careful of his ribs. "I know," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. 12 years of mornings and winters and children and horses and apples and straight window sills and the mountains outside the window. "I know too," she said. He lifted her hand and held it to his cheek and closed his eyes, and she stayed there for a long time, and the fire burned and the wind moved in the pines, and everything was completely, entirely, unassailably fine. He healed as she had known he would, because Eli Kane was made of something durable. By February he was out of bed, and by March he was back in the timber, though she had negotiated a compromise about working alone up there that he conceded with the grace of a man who understood that some negotiations are not really negotiations. Spring of 1892 brought 2 things: the 4-year-old Margaret's very firm announcement that she intended to be a doctor when she grew up, delivered at the supper table with a finality that precluded argument, and a letter from James Beaumont saying that he had been offered a position in Denver and that the family would be moving south in the fall. Margaret Beaumont's letter, arriving a week later, was more personal and considerably more colorful in its expression of mixed feelings about Denver, which she clearly found provincial. Clara wrote back immediately, and then put the letter down and sat for a moment in the kitchen with the windows open to the spring air, thinking about what it would mean not to have Margaret a day's journey away, and feeling the particular, manageable sadness of a good life's natural changes. Eli found her there and sat across the table. "It is a good position for James," she said, "and Denver has better schools for William and Ruth." "Yes," he said. "I will miss her considerably." "I know." He paused. "We can go to Denver in the winters. The children should know the city." She looked at him. He looked back, and the practicality and the love were the same thing, as they always were with him. "All right," she said. The summer of that year was the best yet. Warm without cruelty, the creek running full and clear, the orchard producing more than she could process, which meant preserves for all of Elkhorn and several families in the valley besides. Thomas Eli had his first real conversation with a girl his age at the Harvest Social in Elkhorn, which Eli watched from across the room with an expression that Clara, watching him watch their son, found entirely endearing. "You are looking at him like he is a horse you are assessing," she whispered. "I am assessing," Eli said. "He is 12. He's 13 next month. Still." He looked at her sidelong, and she laughed, and he reached over and took her hand in the crowd and held it, the way he always held it, completely, without any self-consciousness, as if holding her hand were simply the natural position for his hand to be in. The valley grew and changed over those years, as the territory and then the state of Wyoming changed, more homesteaders coming in, new families settling the land around them, a school established in Elkhorn that grew from 1 room to 2 and then to 3. Clara became the kind of woman that new settlers sought out, the one who had been there long enough to know things, who gave practical advice without condescension, who had the specific credibility of someone who had built their life here from raw difficulty and knew the difference between what was hard and what was genuinely dangerous. She never forgot what it had felt like to walk those miles through the sage flats with Biscuit behind her, and no plan and no strength, and the baby growing inside her. She carried that memory not as a wound, but as a compass. It told her true north on the question of what mattered and who needed help and what she had to offer. Elk come off the mountains in the fall and move through the cane land at dawn, and every year in October when the cold came back and the sky turned the particular iron gray of Wyoming winter building, Eli would come and stand beside her on the porch, and they would watch the elk moving through the meadow below the apple tree. And neither of them needed to say anything about what October in Wyoming had once meant and what it meant now. Margaret, young Margaret, the self-declared future doctor, grew up with that fierce assessor's gaze and her father's directness and her mother's stubbornness, and made it clear by the time she was 14 that the declaration she had made at 4 was not childish fancy but actual intention. Eli, who had no theory about what women could or could not do that was not derived from direct empirical evidence, took this in stride. He wrote to James Beaumont in Denver, asking about the schools there and what possibilities existed, and James wrote back with information about a women's medical college in Philadelphia, which was where it had all begun for Clara, which made her sit down suddenly at the kitchen table with the letter and laugh at the strange circles things made. James Eli, the loud, opinionated, endlessly energetic James, became at 15 the person in the valley who everyone went to if they wanted something organized, which was a character trait that appeared to have arrived from somewhere in the middle distance of inheritance, and surprised everyone except Clara, who had always known James contained multitudes. Thomas Eli, the oldest, the one with the big dark eyes and the horses and the steadiness that had come straight from the man who raised him. Thomas became, at 17, almost exactly what Eli had been at that age. Clara watched them together sometimes, the two of them with the horses or out on the land, the height and the build so similar, the way of moving through the world so similar. And she thought about all the kinds of fathers there were, and what it meant to choose one's child as deliberately and completely as Eli had chosen hers. She told him this once, in their bed in the winter of 1896, with the snow deep outside and the fire high. "You chose him," she said. "From the very first night. You knew about him and you chose him." Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I chose you. He was part of you. There was no separation." She looked at the ceiling and felt the years in her chest, all of them, the grief and the joy and the love, enormous and quiet and lasting. "Eli," she said. "Yes. I'm glad it was you, in the pines, that it was you who found me." He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her. The firelight was soft and the house was warm, and outside Wyoming was being the enormous, indifferent, beautiful thing it had always been. "I'm glad I knew where to look," he said. They lay in the silence for a while, the comfortable silence of two people who have spent enough years together that silence is its own conversation. "There is one more thing I want to tell you," she said. He waited. "I am expecting again?" The silence changed quality. Then, slowly, the contained genuine smile appeared. 17 years of it, and it still did what it always did to her. "How?" he started. "I think you know how," she said. He laughed, the real, full laugh, and she laughed too. And outside the snow was falling on the apple tree and the porch and the straight windowsills, and the medicine bow peaks were white against the winter sky, and the elk were somewhere in the dark timber, and the Kane homestead lay warm and bright in the enormous Wyoming night, as it had for all the years since a woman with $43 and no strength left to argue had followed a mountain man north through the pines, not knowing yet what she was walking toward, knowing only that she was still walking, still alive, still carrying the future inside her, and that had turned out to be more than enough. The last baby was a boy, born in August of 1897, a warm summer morning with the windows open and the orchard heavy with fruit, and Thomas Eli, 18 years old and already his father's height, pacing in the yard below the window with the nervous energy of a firstborn who has assigned himself the responsibility of being ready for whatever is needed. James and Margaret, 15 and 13, waited on the porch with the patience of children who had been through this before. They named him Eli. Just Eli, with no other name attached, the simplest thing, the truest thing, the name of a man who had been everything. Clara held the baby and looked across at her husband, gray now at the temples, still broad and immovable and strong, still the same dark eyes that had found her in the Wyoming pines 20 years before. And she said, "Eli Kane." He looked at her and then at the baby and back at her, and the look on his face was the same look he had worn the first time, on the night Thomas Eli was born, and on their wedding day, and on the Christmas night she had felt the baby move, and he had covered her hand with his. It was the look of a man who knew exactly how much he had. "Eli Kane," he said. Outside, in the yard, Thomas called up, "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Clara called back, and she meant it in all the ways a person can mean a word. She looked at her husband in the morning light, this mountain of a man who had stepped out of the pines at the exact right moment in the exact right way, who had said, "You are coming with me," and had meant it as a promise more complete than anything she could have asked for. And she thought about that October morning in 1878, the dust settling, the cold coming, the mountains to the west, the absolute emptiness of her situation, and the small stubborn flame of the life inside her. And she thought, look what became of it. Outside, the apple tree bore fruit in the August warmth. Thomas Hale's line of trees, now stretching from the old foundation clear to the creek, waited with small red apples. The mountains stood as they had always stood. The creek ran as it had always run. Clara Kane put her infant son to her chest and leaned into her husband's arm and watched the morning come through the straight windowsills, and the story of her life, all of it, every hard and magnificent chapter of it, settled into its right and final shape, complete, closed, whole, the way a thing is whole when it has been given everything it was supposed to be.